Imagine this. You're 37,000 feet above the Pacific Ocean, halfway between Los Angeles and Tokyo on Japan Airlines Flight 447. The cabin is dimly lit for the overnight flight, passengers are sleeping under blankets, and flight attendants are quietly serving tea to those still awake. Everything seems perfectly normal until the plane suddenly drops 2,000 feet in 3 seconds, throwing passengers against the ceiling. Then the captain's panicked voice crackles over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a critical emergency. If there are any pilots on board, please identify yourselves immediately." Every passenger who's still conscious turns to look around the cabin, confusion and terror spreading like wildfire through the aircraft. But in seat 14A, a quiet woman in her 40s slowly removes her noise-canceling headphones. She's been wearing a simple black hoodie and jeans, looking like any other passenger trying to sleep through the long flight to Japan. Nobody knew her real identity. Nobody knew what she was capable of. Her name was Captain Jessica "Lightning" Chen, and she was about to prove that sometimes the most unlikely heroes are sitting right next to you. What none of the 312 passengers on board realized was that the woman they'd been ignoring for the past 6 hours was actually the most decorated test pilot in the history of the United States Air Force. A pilot who had flown experimental aircraft that officially didn't exist, who had pushed the boundaries of flight physics in machines that could kill you if you made one wrong move. Jessica had been traveling to Japan under a false identity, trying to escape a military career that had cost her everything she'd ever cared about. She was running from a classified incident that had destroyed her reputation, her marriage, and her will to fly. The woman who had once been fearless in the cockpit now couldn't even look at an airplane without having panic attacks. But when that captain's desperate call echoed through the cabin, something deep inside Jessica's pilot instincts awakened against her will. She unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up, her legs shaking not from the turbulence but from the terror of what she was about to volunteer for. Other passengers stared at her as she made her way to the front of the plane, whispers following in her wake. Is she really a pilot? Can a woman handle something like this? Jessica ignored them all, her jaw set with the determination that had once made her a legend among test pilots. When she reached the cockpit door, what she found was worse than she had imagined. The captain was slumped over the controls, blood streaming from a head wound where he'd been thrown against the instrument panel during the sudden altitude loss. His co-pilot was conscious but in obvious pain, one arm hanging useless at his side from what looked like a dislocated shoulder. Warning alarms were screaming from every system on the flight deck. "Who are you?" gasped the co-pilot, trying to maintain control with his good arm. Jessica looked at the instrument panel and immediately recognized the crisis they were facing. Captain Jessica Chen, United States Air Force Test Pilot Division. Your captain is unconscious, your hydraulics are failing, and you've lost 2 engines. How long do we have? The co-pilot's eyes widened in recognition of her call sign. Lightning? You're Lightning, Chen? But I thought you were... He stopped himself before saying what everyone in the aviation world knew about her recent disgrace. Yeah, I thought I was done flying too, Jessica said grimly, sliding into the captain's seat. But 312 people are about to die if someone doesn't figure out how to land this plane with no engines and no hydraulics. What Jessica didn't tell the co-pilot was that she was absolutely terrified. The last time she had been in a cockpit, she had been flying the experimental X-47 stealth fighter when a system malfunction had caused her to crash into a residential neighborhood. The official report blamed mechanical failure, but Jessica knew the truth. She had made a split-second decision that saved her own life but destroyed a family's home and killed their 8-year-old daughter. The guilt from that incident had driven Jessica to resign from the Air Force and refuse to fly any aircraft ever again. She had been seeing therapists for post-traumatic stress, taking medication for anxiety attacks, and living in isolation because she couldn't face the responsibility of other people's lives in her hands. But now, 37,000 feet above the Pacific Ocean, 312 passengers were depending on her to overcome her trauma and remember how to be the pilot she used to be. Jessica gripped the controls and felt the familiar weight of an aircraft that was fighting for its life. The Boeing 777 was designed to fly with sophisticated computer systems that managed everything from engine power to flight control surfaces. But with the hydraulic systems failing, those computers were useless. Jessica would have to fly this massive commercial jet the way she had learned to fly experimental aircraft, by feel, instinct, and pure skill. "What's our situation?" she asked the co-pilot, whose name tag read Yamamoto. "We lost the number 2 engine about 10 minutes ago," Officer Yamamoto reported, struggling to work the controls with his good arm. "Number 3 engine is running rough and losing power. Hydraulic system A is completely gone. System B is at 20%. We're losing altitude at about 500 feet per minute." Jessica quickly calculated their options, and none of them were good. They were still 400 miles from the nearest airport, flying a plane that was barely controllable and losing power by the minute. Even if they could maintain their current altitude, which was unlikely, they would run out of fuel long before reaching any runway. But Jessica had flown aircraft in impossible situations before, and she had learned that sometimes the difference between survival and disaster was the willingness to attempt solutions that seemed impossible. "Officer Yamamoto, I need you to trust me and follow my instructions exactly. We're going to attempt something that's never been tried with a commercial airliner." "What are you planning?" Jessica's hands moved across the instrument panel with the precision that had made her famous in test pilot circles. "We're going to use engine asymmetry and differential thrust to maintain control without hydraulics. It's a technique that was developed for military aircraft that lose control systems in combat." What Jessica was attempting had never been done with a passenger jet, but she had used similar techniques to save experimental aircraft that had suffered catastrophic system failures during test flights. The principle was simple but extremely dangerous. By carefully managing the power from their remaining engines, she could use thrust vectoring to steer the aircraft instead of relying on traditional control surfaces that required hydraulic pressure. But one mistake in power management, it was like performing surgery with sledgehammers, requiring a level of touch and sensitivity that most pilots couldn't achieve even in perfect conditions. Slowly, incredibly, the plane began to respond. The descent rate decreased from 500 feet per minute to 300, then to 200. The aircraft's attitude stabilized, and for the first time since the emergency began, Jessica felt like she might have a chance to save everyone on board. But their troubles were far from over. "We've got another problem," Officer Yamamoto said, pointing to his instruments. "The weather ahead is deteriorating rapidly. There's a typhoon moving across our flight path, and Tokyo Airport has just closed due to severe weather conditions." Jessica looked at the weather radar display and saw a massive storm system that covered hundreds of miles, with wind speeds that would make landing impossible even for a fully functional aircraft. "What about alternate airports? Seoul is socked in with fog, and Osaka is reporting severe crosswinds. The only clear weather is at Yokota Air Base, but that's a military installation with a much shorter runway." Jessica knew Yokota Air Base. It was where she had trained with Japanese Air Self-Defense Force pilots during joint exercises. The runway was designed for military fighters, not massive commercial jets, and landing there would require precision that pushed the boundaries of what was possible, even with a fully functional aircraft. With a damaged plane and failing systems, attempting to land at Yokota would be like threading a needle while riding a roller coaster. But it was their only chance. "Officer Yamamoto, contact Yokota Air Base and tell them we're declaring an emergency. Request priority landing clearance and ask them to have emergency vehicles standing by." As they began their approach to Yokota, Jessica realized that everything in her life had been preparing her for this moment. All the experimental aircraft she had flown, all the impossible situations she had survived, all the techniques she had learned for flying damaged planes in combat conditions. It had all been leading to this night when 312 innocent people needed someone who could do the impossible. The approach to Yokota was the most challenging flying Jessica had ever attempted. She had to manage engine power with computer-like precision while compensating for crosswinds that were gusting up to 40 knots. The runway at Yokota was less than half the length that a Boeing 777 normally required for landing, which meant she would have to touch down at exactly the right spot and stop the aircraft in a distance that left no room for error. In the passenger cabin, people were praying, crying, and holding hands with strangers. Flight attendants were preparing for a crash landing, demonstrating emergency positions and trying to keep passengers calm despite their own obvious fear. But in the cockpit, Jessica was entering what test pilots call the zone, a state of absolute focus where conscious thought disappears and instinct takes over. Her hands moved across the controls with supernatural precision, making thousands of tiny adjustments that kept the damaged aircraft on the correct approach path. She could feel the plane's behavior changing as they descended, responding to the shifting air currents and the loss of hydraulic pressure that made every control input a gamble. "We're coming in too fast," Officer Yamamoto warned. "Even with full brakes, we won't be able to stop in time." Jessica had one more trick that she had learned from flying experimental aircraft: aerodynamic braking using engine reverse thrust and controlled flight surface manipulation that would slow the aircraft dramatically but required perfect timing to avoid a stall that would send them crashing short of the runway. "On my mark, cut power to all engines and deploy full spoilers," she told Yamamoto. "We're going to use the aircraft's own aerodynamics to slow us down before we touch the ground." It was a technique that existed only in test pilot manuals, something that had never been attempted with a commercial airliner full of passengers. At 500 feet above the runway, Jessica called for the power reduction. The massive Boeing 777 suddenly became a glider, its enormous wings creating drag that slowed their approach speed to something that might, just barely, allow them to stop before running out of runway. But now they were committed. There was no going around, no second chance. They would either land successfully or crash trying. The runway lights rushed toward them as Jessica made final adjustments to their approach angle. She could see emergency vehicles lining the runway, their flashing lights creating a pathway toward what she hoped would be safety for everyone on board. The landing was the hardest Jessica had ever experienced. The aircraft hit the runway with tremendous force, bouncing once before slamming back down onto the tarmac. Jessica immediately applied maximum braking while using reverse thrust from their remaining engines to slow their forward momentum. The plane screamed down the runway, eating up distance at an alarming rate. Jessica could see the end of the runway approaching fast, and she realized they might not stop in time. That's when she made one final desperate decision. At the last possible moment, Jessica deliberately ground-looped the aircraft, using a technique that would normally destroy the plane but would transfer their forward momentum into a controlled spin that would bring them to a stop. The Boeing 777 spun 180 degrees before coming to rest just 50 feet from the end of the runway, damaged but Officer Yamamoto looked at her with an expression of awe and gratitude. "Captain Chen, what you just did, that was impossible. You saved everyone on this plane." But Jessica shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No, they saved me. For 3 years, I've been carrying the guilt of that family I killed in the crash. I thought I'd never be able to fly again without seeing that little girl's face. What changed?" Jessica looked back through the cockpit door at the passengers who were hugging each other and crying with relief. "I realized that running away from responsibility doesn't honor the people who died. Using my skills to save others does." When the emergency slides were deployed and passengers began evacuating, something remarkable happened. Instead of rushing to escape, people started thanking Jessica personally. They formed a line to shake her hand, to hug her, to tell her that she had given them a chance to see their families again. An elderly Japanese man bowed deeply and said, "You are a true samurai of the sky." A young mother with 2 small children pressed a photo into Jessica's hand and said, "My babies will grow up because of your courage tonight." But the moment that changed everything for Jessica came when a little girl, maybe 8 years old, walked up to her with tears in her eyes. "Miss Pilot," the girl said, "my daddy says you're a hero. Are you really a hero?" Jessica knelt down to the child's level, seeing not the face of the girl who had died in her crash, but the face of a child who would live to grow up because Jessica had found the courage to fly again. "Sweetheart," Jessica said gently, "heroes aren't people who are never afraid. Heroes are people who are scared but do the right thing anyway." The investigation that followed revealed the full extent of what Jessica had accomplished. Aviation experts called it the most skillful emergency landing in commercial aviation history. The techniques she had used to control the aircraft without hydraulics were so innovative that they were immediately incorporated into pilot training programs worldwide. But more importantly, Jessica's story inspired a new understanding of how trauma can be transformed into strength when people find the courage to serve others despite their own pain. Jessica was offered positions at major airlines, aircraft manufacturers, and government agencies. Test pilot programs around the world wanted her to lead their most advanced projects. But Jessica made a different choice. She established the Lightning Flight Academy, a program that trained pilots to handle emergency situations that weren't covered in standard aviation courses. Her academy became the world's leading center for teaching pilots how to fly damaged aircraft, save passengers in crisis situations, and overcome the psychological challenges that could freeze pilots during emergencies. But the most important program Jessica created was one that nobody outside the aviation industry knew about. She began counseling pilots who had been involved in crashes, helping them understand that survival guilt and professional shame didn't have to end their ability to serve others. Jessica's own experience had taught her that sometimes the greatest tragedy can become the foundation for the greatest service. Over the next 5 years, pilots trained by Jessica's academy saved thousands of lives in situations that would have been fatal without the techniques she taught. HER methods for flying damaged aircraft became standard training in military and commercial aviation programs worldwide, but Jessica's greatest pride wasn't in the lives saved by her students. It was in the pilots she had helped overcome their own trauma and return to flying with renewed purpose and confidence. Today, Captain Jessica Lightning Chen continues to teach at her flight academy, but she also returns regularly to active flying, piloting humanitarian missions that bring medical supplies and disaster relief to remote areas around the world. She carries with her always a photo of the family that died in her experimental aircraft crash, not as a reminder of her failure, but as a promise that their sacrifice would be honored through every life she saves and every pilot she teaches to overcome their own fears and limitations. The woman who once thought she would never fly again became the pilot who taught others that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision to serve others despite being afraid. And sometimes, that decision transforms not just the lives of those you save, but your own life as well. Sometimes they're sitting quietly nearby, waiting for the moment when their skills and courage are needed most. Life is unpredictable, and you never know when the person next to you might be the one who saves everyone. Jessica Chen didn't ask for a second chance to prove herself, but when 312 lives were at stake, she proved that redemption is always possible for those brave enough to try again. Sometimes the most broken among us become the most powerful healers. Sometimes the most fearful become the most courageous. And sometimes, the person who thinks they have nothing left to offer becomes exactly the hero the world needs. If this story moved you, remember that courage is contagious, redemption is possible, and heroes are all around us. They just might be hiding in seat 14A, waiting for their moment to save the day.